Niobrara breaks, Nebraska, October, 1952. The wind already had a winter edge to it, a dry rasp that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods along the riverbed. It was a wind that promised hardship, a familiar promise in that part of the country. And on a low rise overlooking the river valley, Lajos Bognár was doing something that made no sense at all. He was mortaring river stones, one by one, onto the corrugated steel flank of his Quonset hut. The hut itself was nothing special, a surplus military cylinder of steel and bolts. It was a common enough sight on the post-war plains, a cheap and fast solution for shelter. But what Lajos was doing was unheard of. He worked with a slow, practiced rhythm, his hands dark with lime mortar, his movements economical. He would select a stone from the carefully sorted pile, dark, dense, heavy with iron, heft it for a moment, then bed it into the thick mortar against the Quonset's southern curve. Tap, tap, settle. Another stone. Royce Tasker pulled his Ford pickup to a stop on the dirt track, kicking up a cloud of pale dust. As the local dealer for new-build Quonset kits and more lucratively, the insulation packages to make them survivable, Tasker considered himself the final authority on these buildings. He watched Lajos for a long moment, a frown deepening on his face. Two other ranchers, the Jensen brothers, had already stopped their work to watch the bizarre spectacle. "What in God's name does he think he's doing?" Orville Jensen muttered, leaning against a fence post. Tasker got out of his truck, slamming the door. He didn't address Lajos directly, but spoke to the Jensens loud enough for the wind to carry his words. "That's Lajos Bognár, Hungarian fella. He's building his own failure, is what he's doing." He pointed a thick finger at the wall of rising stone. "I sell these things. I know the engineering. Those ribs are rated for an 80-mile-an-hour wind load, a snow load. They are not rated for a static vertical load of, what is that? 10, 12 tons of rock?" He shook his head, a performance of expert pity. "He's going to shear the bolt seams right off at the foundation plate. Come the spring thaw. When the ground shifts, that whole crazy wall is going to buckle and slide right off. It's the most foolish thing I've ever seen." Lajos heard them. He paused, his trowel halfway to the mortar bucket, and looked over. He didn't scowl. He didn't offer a defense. He simply met Tasker's gaze for a second, then turned back to his work. Tap, tap, settle. The sound was small against the vastness of the prairie wind. What did this Hungarian Komuves, this Danube cobble mason, understand about diurnal thermal storage that the man who sold these steel buildings by the dozen had missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn a principle of physics so simple and powerful it can turn a pile of common rocks into a furnace that runs for free. You'll understand the difference between insulation and thermal mass, and why one is a shield while the other is a battery. This channel is dedicated to the lost wisdom of our ancestors, the quiet geniuses who solved impossible problems with what they had at hand. To support that mission, please consider subscribing and liking this video. And let me know in the comments, have you ever seen an old building that used a clever, low-tech trick to stay warm? Lajos Bognár was not a farmer. He was not a rancher, nor a carpenter, nor any of the trades that the Niobrara breaks understood and respected. In the old country, on the banks of the Danube, he was a Komuves, a stone worker. But that simple translation missed the soul of his craft. He didn't just build walls, he worked with time and temperature. His tools were not merely hammers and trowels, they were instruments for reading the sun. He knew the character of the stones pulled from the river, the dark basalt that drank the afternoon light and held it for hours, the paler granite that offered a quicker, cooler release. His hands were calloused from a lifetime of handling lime, sand, and the dense, patient weight of the earth itself. He had faced houses in river cobble, sizing each stone not just for fit, but for its thermal signature, orchestrating a slow cascade of warmth that would bleed into the sleeping hours long after the sun had set. He had brought his wife, Ilona, and their two small children, Peter and Zofia, to America for the promise of land, a place to build a life free from the shadows of war and shifting borders. What they received was a 160-acre parcel of windswept Nebraska land and the metal shell of a war-surplus Quonset hut, purchased for a few $100s. It was, they were told, a start. Their first winter, the winter of 1951, was not a start. It was a siege. The Quonset, an elegant solution for storing airplanes in temperate climates, was a thermal catastrophe on the frozen prairie. The cold was not merely an absence of heat, it was an active, malevolent presence. It radiated from the thin steel walls with a metallic intensity that seeped into their bones. The window putty, hardened by the relentless chill, didn't crack. It shattered like glass when Zofia tapped it with a curious finger. The enamel on the dog's water dish, left too close to the wall, split with a sharp crack, the porcelain flaking away from the steel beneath. Lajos found a potato Ilona had forgotten on a windowsill. It had turned into a solid, glassy orb of ice, hard as agate. They burned propane at a terrifying rate, the heater roaring day and night, yet the heat it produced rose immediately to the apex of the curved ceiling, leaving the concrete floor a slab of ice. Cold air, chilled by contact with the steel walls, cascaded down the arcs and pooled around their feet. Ilona wrapped Peter's and Zofia's feet in burlap sacks before tucking them into beds piled high with every blanket they owned. They slept in their coats. Lajos would lie awake at night, feeling the vibrations of the wind through the steel ribs, feeling the cold press in, and he knew a shame deeper than any he had ever experienced. He was a builder, a man whose trade was shelter, and he had brought his family to a place where they would freeze. He had failed in his most fundamental duty. The problem, Lajos understood, was not the Nebraska winter. The problem was the house. The conventional wisdom, as peddled by men like Royce Tasker, was to fight the cold from the inside out. Tasker's primary business was selling insulation kits. For a steep price, he would supply interior framing, studs, and rolls of fiberglass batting to be installed against the steel walls, then covered with drywall. It was an attempt to create a barrier, to hold the precious, expensive heat from the propane furnace inside for just a little longer before it inevitably escaped. Their neighbors, the Millers and the Jensens, and a dozen other families in similar Quonsets or drafty farmhouses, were all fighting the same battle. They stuffed rags into the gaps around their window frames. They nailed tar paper over their north-facing walls. They ran their wood stoves and furnaces so hard the metal glowed, cherry red, burning through cords of wood and tanks of propane at a ruinous pace. Still, the cold won. Their windows were opaque, with thick, fern-like patterns of ice on the inside. The Miller's water pump froze solid in its housing, forcing them to haul water from the well by the bucket. The Jensens effectively abandoned 2 rooms of their house, hanging blankets in the doorways and crowding their entire lives into the kitchen, the only space the big cook stove could keep tolerable. The fundamental failure was one of physics. The corrugated steel of the Quonset had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of virtually 0. It conducted heat with ruthless efficiency. Any molecule of warm air that touched the interior wall instantly transferred its energy to the steel, which then radiated it out into the -20 degrees Fahrenheit winter air. The insulation kits helped, but they were a thin shield against an overwhelming force. They slowed the bleeding, but couldn't stop it. The houses were sieves, constantly demanding more fuel, more heat, only to shed it moments later. They were fighting a war of attrition against the second law of thermodynamics, and they were losing. As the brutal winter finally gave way to a muddy spring, Lajos Bognár made a decision. He would not spend another winter fighting the cold. He would not buy Tasker's expensive, inadequate shield. He would use the knowledge of his hands and the memory of the Danube. He would not fight the cold. He would recruit the sun. Beginning in May, he started making trips to the banks of the Niobrara River with his wheelbarrow. He was not merely gathering rocks. He was harvesting. He ignored the pale, porous limestone and the crumbly sandstone. He searched for the dark, heavy cobbles, the ones smoothed by 1,000,000 years of river current, granite, basalt, gabbro. He would lay a dozen specimens out on a sandbar in the morning sun. At noon, he would return and lay his palm on each one. He chose the ones that felt hottest, the ones that had drunk the most sunlight in the shortest time. He was selecting for low albedo and high density. He was choosing his batteries. By late summer, a mountain of dark, carefully graded stones stood beside the Quonset. Then he began mixing his mortar. It wasn't the hard, fast-setting Portland cement the Americans favored. It was a lime-based mortar, a recipe centuries old. It was more flexible, more forgiving, and, crucially, it was hygroscopic. It could manage moisture, breathing it in and out, preventing the buildup of ice between stone and steel. He started on the south wall, at the concrete foundation, laying the first course of large, flat stones. He worked his way up the great steel arc, bedding each stone in a thick, generous cushion of the lime mortar, pressing it directly against the ridges of the corrugated steel. The work was slow, methodical, an act of faith. He was creating a second skin for his house, a skin of pure mass. He continued around to the west wall, the face that would catch the long, slanting rays of the afternoon sun. He left the north and east walls bare. They received no direct winter sun. Cladding them would be a waste of effort and material. The mockery, which had begun as curious murmuring, grew more confident as the stone skin crept higher. Royce Tasker made a point to drive by whenever he had a customer with him, using Lajos's project as a cautionary tale. "Now, that's what happens when you don't listen to expert advice," he'd say, pointing. He stopped one afternoon when Lajos was on the scaffold, high up the curve. "Lajos, I'm telling you as a friend," Tasker called up, his voice heavy with false concern. "I've seen the blueprints from the manufacturer. I know the stress tolerances on those bolt seams. You're hanging a cliff face on a tin can. The first time you get a real heavy snow, the combined weight is going to pop those seams like buttons on a fat man's shirt. This whole thing will come down." Jebediah Smith, a local carpenter known for his sturdy barns, stopped by as well. He ran a hand over the stones, then tapped the steel. "Steel and stone expand and contract at different rates, Lajos," he said, shaking his head. "When the sun hits this wall, that steel is going to heat up fast, and the stone will heat up slow. Then at night, the steel will get cold fast, and the stone will stay warm. You're building a fight into your own wall. It'll tear itself apart before you get through 2 winters." Lajos listened patiently from his scaffold. He wiped mortar from his hands with a rag. To Tasker's dire warnings of structural collapse, he said only, "The arch is strong. The load is spread." To Jebediah's concerns about thermal expansion, he replied, "The lime will hold. It breathes." Then he would turn back to his work, leaving them to shake their heads and drive away, confident in their conventional wisdom. One evening, Ilona came out to watch him as the sun set, casting long shadows from the unfinished wall. "They look at our home like it is a strange beast, Lajos," she said softly, her arms crossed against the cooling air. "A steel animal growing a stone skin." Lajos looked at the wall, then at her. He smiled, a rare and weary thing. "A warm skin, Ilona," he said. "That is all that matters." To understand what the neighbors, the carpenter, and Royce Tasker couldn't see, you have to understand a principle they never considered: diurnal thermal storage. Their entire concept of warmth was built around insulation, R value, the resistance to heat passing through a material. A thick wool coat has a high R value. A thin steel sheet has a very low one. Their solution was to wrap the steel box in a thicker coat. Lajos Bognár was doing something entirely different. He wasn't focused on resistance, he was focused on capacity. He was building a thermal battery. The scientific term is thermal mass. While insulation is like a shield, trying to stop heat from escaping, thermal mass is like a sponge, designed to soak heat up and release it slowly. A pound of dense stone like the basalt Lajos favored can store a significant amount of heat energy, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs. Lajos wasn't adding pounds of stone. He was adding over 12 tons of it to the sun-facing walls of his house. The engine for this system was the sun. During a Nebraska winter, the sun hangs low in the southern sky. This low angle means its rays strike a south-facing vertical wall at a near perpendicular angle, maximizing the energy transfer. This is called solar gain. Royce Tasker's Quonset, with its reflective steel, would bounce most of this energy away. Lajos's wall, made of dark, rough-textured river cobbles, did the opposite. It had a low albedo, meaning it absorbed a huge percentage of the incoming solar radiation. On a clear winter day, even with an air temperature of 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the surface of those dark stones could reach 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 70 degrees Fahrenheit in the direct sun. This is where the magic happens, the time lag. That heat absorbed by the stones at 2 in the afternoon doesn't just vanish when a cloud passes or the sun sets. It begins a slow, deliberate migration inward, moving through the 12 inches of stone and lime mortar. This journey takes hours. The peak temperature on the outside of the wall at 2 p.m. becomes a gentle, steady warmth, radiating from the inside of the wall at 8 p.m., 9 p.m., even midnight. The stone wall became a massive, silent, slow-release radiator. While the neighbors' furnaces roared to combat the plummeting nighttime temperatures, Lajos's wall was calmly breathing the day's sunshine back into his home. It flattened the brutal temperature curve of the prairie, absorbing the peak energy of the day and using it to soften the deep cold of the night. He hadn't built a shield. He had built a flywheel, a thermal engine that smoothed out the erratic jolts of winter. December arrived, and with it, the Alberta Clippers. They were not singular storms, but a relentless succession of them, a conveyor belt of Arctic fronts sweeping down from Canada. For 11 straight days, the Niobrara breaks were scoured by a hard, dry, unforgiving wind. The temperature at night plunged to minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill made it feel like minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a cold that found every crack, every weakness. It was a cold designed to break things. And it did. The Jensen brothers' new water pump, the one they'd wrapped in 3 layers of burlap, froze and cracked its cast iron housing. The Miller family burned through a full cord of oak in a week, their chimney spewing a constant plume of smoke. Yet the windows in their living room remained coated in a half-inch of opaque white ice. They huddled in their kitchen, the rest of their house surrendered to the polar air. The wind was a physical presence, rattling windows, shrieking around corners, and stripping heat from every surface with terrifying efficiency. Inside the Bognár Quonset, it was quiet. The wind howled outside, a distant, frustrated beast, but inside the air was still. It wasn't hot like a furnace-blasted room. It was profoundly, deeply, evenly not cold. The brutal temperature swings of the outside world were muted, softened. The great curved south wall had become a source of gentle, radiant warmth. Here, the impossible became normal. Ilona, in a simple act of faith and domesticity, was letting her bread dough rise on the kitchen counter, a full 15 feet away from the cook stove. In any other house in the county, the cold drafts would have killed the yeast instantly, turning the dough into a useless lump. Here it swelled, alive and promising. On the floor, Peter and Zofia, wearing simple wool sweaters, not bulky coats, were sorting a basket of dried beans for winter soup, their small hands moving with the unhurried ease of children who are comfortable. The metallic chill, the defining feature of their first winter, was gone. The house felt solid, calm, and safe. As a quiet test of his own, Lajos had filled 2 identical metal pails with water from their well. One he placed on the floor near the unstoned north-facing door, the coldest part of the house. The other he set directly against the steel of the south wall, where the stones on the other side were performing their silent duty. Every morning he would check them. Every morning the pail by the door had a skin of ice, while the water against the warm wall remained entirely liquid. On the 9th day of the clipper run, the temperature bottomed out. Royce Tasker was out on a desperate service call. The brand-new furnace he'd installed for the Henderson family 5 miles east of Bognár's place had failed. Its fuel line gelled by the extreme cold. He'd managed to get it running, but by the time he left, it was late afternoon, and the sky was a bruised purple. The wind was gusting, sculpting the snow into knife-edged drifts across the roads. 2 miles from the main road, the engine of his Ford pickup sputtered, coughed, and died. The fuel in his own line had gelled. He cursed and tried the ignition again and again. Nothing. The cab, which had been a bubble of warmth, began to lose its heat with alarming speed. The wind rocked the truck, and the metal groaned in the cold. Through his windshield, across a field of white wind-lashed snow, he could see the Bognár Quonset. It looked small and absurd, a metal tube with a lumpy stone coat. He was angry, embarrassed, and for the first time, genuinely afraid. He knew how fast a man could freeze to death in a stalled vehicle. He huddled in his coat, pulling his hat down over his ears, and watched the Quonset as the sun, a weak, pale disk, sank below the horizon. And then he saw something that defied every law of building he had ever known. As the last light faded and the world turned a deep, frozen blue, a hard, crystalline rime began to form on every surface, on the fence posts, on the roof of his truck, on the distant silhouettes of barns. But on the south-facing wall of Lajos Bognár's Quonset, something else was happening. A faint, ghostly vapor, like breath on a cold day, began to rise from the dark river stones. The stones were steaming. They were wet, actively melting the super-chilled moisture from the air that touched them. They were bleeding heat into a minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit world. Tasker stared, his mind struggling to process the visual data. The stones should have been the coldest part of the structure, colder than the insulated roof, but they were visibly, undeniably warm. He watched for nearly an hour as darkness fell, the truck's metal groaning as it contracted in the cold, while that strange, stone-clad wall continued its gentle, impossible work. Survival instinct finally won out over pride. He couldn't stay in the truck. He pushed the door open against the wind and began the long, trudging walk through the knee-deep drifts toward the Bognár place. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath. By the time he reached the door and knocked, his face was numb and his hands were clumsy logs. Lajos opened the door and Tasker stumbled in. He braced himself for the familiar shock of a Quonset interior, the blast of cold air from the floor, the drafts, the smell of burning propane. Instead, he stepped into a zone of profound, enveloping stillness. The air didn't move. The biting chill was simply absent. Lajos said nothing, just closed the door behind him and gestured for him to come further inside. As Tasker stamped the snow from his boots, trying to bring feeling back into his feet, he saw the 2 pails of water. The one by the door where he stood had a thick, solid cap of ice, a finger width deep at least. His gaze followed Lajos's to the other side of the room. The second pail sat against the corrugated steel wall. He walked over, his boots loud on the concrete floor. He looked at the water. It was perfectly liquid. Hesitantly, as if approaching a strange animal, Tasker reached out and placed his bare palm flat against the inner steel wall, right where the stones were on the other side. He was expecting a shock of biting metallic cold that would numb his hand. Instead, the steel was warm. Not hot, not even as warm as a human body, but distinctly, miraculously, undeniably warm to the touch. It felt less like metal and more like sun-warmed earth. It felt alive. Tasker snatched his hand back as if he touched a live wire. He stared at the wall, then at the quiet Hungarian man watching him. The confidence, the easy authority he wore like a coat, had vanished. He finally spoke, his voice raspy with cold and awe. "My God, Bognár," he said, "you didn't build a wall. You built a sunset." Royce Tasker's conversion was immediate and total. He didn't offer a flowery apology. His pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, he became the innovation's most unlikely and credible advocate. When farmers came to him complaining about their heating bills, he would tell them, "Go see what the Hungarian did with Riverstone." But the message spread most effectively through a different, more practical channel. In late January, Earl Higgins, the driver for the regional Phillips 66 propane distributor, pulled his big delivery truck up to the Bognár's tank. He hooked up the hose, expecting to pump for 10 minutes to fill what should have been a near-empty tank. After less than 3 minutes, the valve clicked shut. The tank was full. Earl stared at his meter, then at his logbook. He knocked on Lajos's door. "Lajos, this can't be right," he said, tapping the logbook. "Based on your usage last winter, you should have been running on fumes by now. You've barely used a third of a tank since my last fill in November." Lajos, wiping his hands on a rag, simply nodded and pointed to the great stone ark of his house, dark and solid in the bright winter sun. Earl, a man who understood dollars and cents better than physics, whistled low. The proof was right there on his meter. From that day on, Earl became a traveling salesman for Lajos's idea. At his next stop, the Millers, who were taking an emergency delivery they couldn't really afford, he mentioned it while the propane was pumping. "You know," he said, leaning against the fender of his truck, "that Hungarian fella over on the brakes, Bognár. He's mortared river rocks all over the south side of his Quonset. His propane bill is a third of yours. You ought to go take a look." The story traveled the propane route. It was a tangible legend, measured in gallons saved and dollars not spent. By the following spring, 3 other families with Quonsets had started their own piles of Riverstone. By autumn, Royce Tasker, in an act of complete capitulation, had begun selling crude thermal mass kits, not with insulation, but with bags of lime, sand, and a hand-drawn diagram based on what he had seen in Lajos's home. He never claimed the idea as his own. He just told people where it came from. Lajos Bognár, with his Danube-trained hands, and a memory of how the sun warmed the stones along the riverbank, had engineered a solution that anticipated the formal science of passive solar design by decades. Architects and engineers with slide rules and university degrees would later give formal names to what he had done by instinct and observation. They would call it a trombe wall, an unvented thermal mass storage system. They would write papers on the optimal thickness, density, and surface color for maximizing diurnal heat storage. Lajos had figured it out with a wheelbarrow, a trowel, and the quiet wisdom of his trade. He had built a sophisticated, self-regulating heating system that had only one moving part: the sun. The American frontier was a harsh and unforgiving judge of ideas. It didn't care about credentials, theories, or where a man came from. It didn't reward what was fashionable or conventional. It rewarded what worked. Lajos Bognár hadn't invented a new machine or a complex chemical process. He simply listened to a very old rhythm, the ancient partnership between the earth and the sun. He saw the daylight not as a fleeting event, but as a vast, free deposit of energy to be gathered, stored, and spent against the poverty of the night. With patient labor, he built a bank of stone and mortar. And every evening, long after the sun had disappeared below the frozen horizon, he let the daylight pay back the night cold, stone by stone. If you found this story of quiet ingenuity and practical wisdom valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of forgotten history. We believe the past holds solutions for the future. Let us know in the comments, what other old-world building techniques do you think could solve modern problems? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.